Please join me in welcoming the Gresham Frank Jackson Foundation Professor of the Environment, Professor Myles Allen.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, thank you very much for coming in this evening, and I'm glad we didn't have to run the gauntlet of any demonstrators coming in, because this is the kind of topic that gets people riled up. But I'm hoping there'll be plenty to talk about when we come to the questions, because I want to talk about. I meet quite a few people who work in the fossil fuel industry, and I think one of the things I'd like to reflect on this evening is what it must be like working in the fossil fuel industry, because they're all quite thoughtful people, and I've yet to meet anybody in the industry actually who doesn't think we have a problem at all with climate change, and acknowledge and is sort of in any way denying the fact that fossil fuels have a big role to play in it. And one of the big questions we have to ask ourselves is, how will the industry respond to effective climate policy? I put the word effective in there because the kind of climate policies we've got at the moment are pretty ineffective, to be honest. Although people may be complaining about them a lot, they haven't really started to make a difference. And so one of the big questions we need to be thinking about is how the industry may react when actually climate policy starts to matter. And I'm going to draw a couple of analogies with other big problems in the past that may give us some clues as to what we should expect from the industry, and perhaps how we can design policies to work with it. And that's the question of how do we need to respond. I'd like to remind you, those diehards who may remember my first lecture back almost a couple of years ago now, where I introduced you to Art, not his real name, somebody I met in Libya in 2007 or so, when I was the first time I gave a lecture outside of Oxford on the topic of net zero. And he was a Dutch engineer who was about to head out into the desert of Libya to a peculiarly dangerous place in order to drill for oil. And I was a little shy telling him who I was and why I was there. You know, I'm a climate scientist and so on. But he was actually, as soon as I told him, he was very enthusiastic, he totally embraced the climate issue and the importance of it, and was telling me all about how he spent his weekends putting solar water heaters on his own house and his neighbors and so on. Clearly saw no connection between what he did in Libya and what he was doing back home in a nice suburb of The Hague, I think it was, that he lived in. So we've been thinking about Art, or his friends, over the past couple of weeks as COP29 proceeded in Baku in Azerbaijan, a country whose main industry is illustrated here. This is a massive oil rig in the Caspian, supporting the Azeri economy, but also the energy needs of Europe. And there's been a lot of commentary on having another COP, yet another COP, in a petro-state. I've seen lots of headlines like that. Don't forget that COP26, which happened in Glasgow, was also in a bit of a petro-state as well. I mean, the UK actually produces more oil and gas than Azerbaijan does. So before we get too pious about Azerbaijan, we need to remind ourselves of that fact. And amid all the sort of grumbling about the COP and the role of the industry at the COP, we've got to remember what the big picture is, what the Azeris are doing, meeting the world's insatiable demand for fossil fuels. This is global energy consumption by source over the past century, or a couple of centuries, since 1800. And you can see mostly it was delivered by biomass, burning wood for the first century or so. Then we in Britain got the idea of generating energy from coal. Oil took off in the early 20th century. Gas has taken off more recently. And still over 80% of our primary energy is delivered by fossil fuels. The peak was sort of in the high 80s. It peaked around 87% or so around 1990. It's now come down to 82%. At that rate of decline, we'll stop using fossil fuels sometime in 2500. Okay? So although you hear a lot about the transition, it's not happening very quickly. And you can understand the grumpiness or the sort of impatience of people like the UAE presidency of COP28 and the Azeri presidency of COP29, with everybody complaining about them as if it's their fault. But it is an important question for us to understand about what they're planning on doing next, because we cannot deny that this industry has enormous influence in the world. By the way, it was a successful COP in the sense that it was setting out to agree a deal on climate finance, which they did agree, and a deal on global carbon markets, which they also agreed. So those were the sort of two headline things that the Azeri presidency had to deliver, and they managed to deliver it, which is, a great credit to them. They took, you probably have heard the negotiations overran, as they always do, and all that sort of thing. But they did deliver a successful COP, and they delivered a climate finance deal, $300 billion a year. $300 billion a year of climate finance to developing countries to help them deal with the consequences of climate change and transition their energy systems by 2035. These numbers are always impossibly large and impossibly hard to imagine. So just to put it in context, and it's a rather tactless comparison, but it's a relevant one, 300 billion is probably about what the world spent on fossil fuels during the 2 weeks of COP29. So that gives you a sense of the scale and the scale of the industry, of the scale of the service that they're providing to the world. The reason we spend so much is because we need them right now. And so, but it also gives you a sense of, the scale of the climate solutions that are being talked about are still dwarfed by what we spend every year on fossil fuels. So what the industry does next, what the industry does with this money, and how it invests going forward into the future is really important for the success of the climate transition, for the success of our transition to net zero. That's what I want to talk about this evening, and I hope I've convinced you it does matter. The industry certainly has no plans to crawl away and die. And I got a bit of an insight into industry thinking in March of this year when I went to a meeting which you might think of as the anti-COP. So I don't know if you knew this, but 6 months after every COP, there's an anti-COP. Sorry, I'm a physicist, so you sort of imagine these two particles annihilating with a burst of energy if that would ever happen. So in Houston, in Texas, the fossil fuel industry gathers every year to decide what to do next and to cut deals and where to drill and what the latest drilling technology is and so on. It's very exciting. Well, I don't know, it wasn't that. I mean, it was an interesting meeting. Exciting for some, perhaps. And here is the chief executive, Amin Nasser, the chief executive of Saudi Aramco, the largest fossil fuel company in the world, speaking at CERAWeek about the industry's vision for the future. And he was pretty clear. These are some of the things he said. The full message from consumers, he's very clear that they are providing a service to consumers, is this: they want energy that helps protect the planet and their pocketbooks, with minimal disruption to supplies and their daily lives. That's his analysis. Unfortunately, the current transition strategy, and I think he was talking about COPs here, overlooks these broader messages from consumers. It focuses almost exclusively on replacing hydrocarbons with alternatives, more on sources than on reducing emissions. So Saudi Aramco, at least, has no intention of transitioning away from hydrocarbons. And this isn't unique to Saudi Arabia. If we look globally, I'm quoting some figures here from the United Nations Environment Programme Production Gap Report that they produce every year, every couple of years. And the red line here shows what they, looking at government plans for producing fossil fuels over the next 25 years to 2050, how they compare to what we will actually need if we're actually going to limit global warming to 2 degrees, which is the green line, or 1.5 degrees, which is the blue. So that's the production gap they're talking about. which is gargantuan, because these fossil fuels, if extracted, will get burnt. So what the United Nations Environment Programme is drawing attention to is governments on the one hand are saying we're going to transition away from fossil fuels, and on the other hand, they're planning with companies like Saudi Aramco and of course the big independent oil and gas producers to keep extracting more and more. Where's all this coming from? Well, let's break it down by fuel. Coal production in government plans, and of course plans are not necessarily going to be put into place, but at the moment in government plans, coal production is actually expected to rise, and I'll tell you where it's going to rise in a minute, before starting to decline perhaps after the 2030s or so. That's in stark contrast to what has to happen if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees, which is we basically need to stop using coal right now. The reason for that, the reason that collapse in coal demand is so strong in those scenarios, of course, is that coal is already not a very sensible energy source. In most parts of the world, photovoltaics and wind are actually cheaper than coal. So why do people still, it's an interesting question, why governments are still planning to invest on more coal production. And the fact is that it's not just the overall cost of an energy source that determines whether people decide to use it. If you're a minister in a developing country and your voters are complaining because they're facing power cuts, buying a second-hand coal-fired power station from China, and there's plenty of them and they're very cheap, is really straightforward, and you can have the lights on again quite quickly. You need to fork out an awful lot more capital if you're going to do the same, generate the same amount of energy with renewables, even if in the long term it's actually cheaper for your country. And so and particularly, of course, if the coal supplier is helpfully offering you attractive financing terms for your coal-fired power station. So that's the reason we see this great mismatch between what makes economic sense and what countries are actually planning to produce. Partly perhaps the countries are not actually are taking the transition that seriously yet, but also because there are these sort of distorted short-term priorities in how countries are generating their power. Oil production, countries are planning to sort of keep producing at roughly the current rate, whereas they both need to go down in both scenarios. And gas actually they're planning to increase gas production. If we look at where this is happening, it's important to see there's big differences between income level of countries as to where this new production will come from. Most of the coal production comes from upper middle income countries, most of it from China. We'll see the breakdown by country in a minute. Oil and gas production, but a fair chunk from low-income countries as well. So that's important because this is low-income countries providing their own energy needs, and that's a particularly difficult one to address. Oil production and gas production are in many ways, fortunately, concentrated in upper middle and high-income countries. Maybe that's cause and effect, is if you have oil and gas, you automatically become middle and high income. But that's helpful in the sense that it means you're no longer having to sort of deal with production that might be sort of almost subsistence level production in very poor countries. And because I'm sure you're wondering, what are the countries that are planning on this production? Coal, very much dominated by China. More than half global coal production at the moment, but they are planning on turning that. They've already peaked their coal production in China. It's starting a gentle decline, and that will continue further. There's a wedge there from India, though, the pale blue. Notice that actually goes up, and we'll focus on that again in a minute. Oil production is much more of a sort of rainbow. The big green wedge at the bottom there is the US, and the sort of teal color is Saudi Arabia. Those are the big two at the bottom. The UK, you can't really see the line, but it is somewhere on there, but it's one of the little fine lines near the top. And gas, likewise. And you can see again, US and Qatar and the Russian Federation dominating gas production. So this is what China's planning to do. They are planning to reduce their coal production, and they produce a certain amount of oil and gas, which they intend to stabilize. They don't intend to phase them out. United States is reducing its coal production, but not intending on current plans to reduce it to zero. Oil, keeping it stable. Gas, they plan to increase. A lot of that LNG, which they're exporting now. Indonesia is increasing its coal, a very large coal producer, increasing it, although, and gas, modest increases in gas. The sort of vertical scale here is in units of energy, so these are sort of more or less comparable. India, coal plans are quite dramatic. They plan to double their coal production quite rapidly. In this context, the United Kingdom here, we stopped producing coal a little while ago, or stopped producing thermal coal anyway. There were plans a few years ago which got everybody riled up about opening a new coal mine in Cumbria, or I gather that they're not planning to do that. In fact, the rumor has it that the company that applied for the permit to open this new coal mine in Cumbria, I hope this won't get me into trouble, but there you are, actually only applied for it because they wanted to be able to say to other people that the UK was still permitting new coal mines. They actually never really had any intention of opening it. Anyway, apparently they now have parked the plans. Who knows, maybe they'll dust them off again. So the UK has stopped producing coal, and oil and gas production, as you can see here, is going down. And if you look at the vertical scales here, you'll also notice that the UK's vertical scale is much blown up, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see it at all. So we're pretty small producers. And of course, we're planning to become even smaller producers with the latest decisions by our government that no new oil and gas licenses will be issued in the North Sea in Labour's current policy. And of course, this was further reinforced by a decision, much celebrated decision by the Supreme Court over an application for an oil well in Surrey, which rather surprised a lot of people, really. They drill for oil in Surrey, but they do. Surrey County Council was taken to court because they didn't take into account the impact of the burning of the oil that would be produced from this well on the climate. I felt rather bad for Surrey County Council because, Saudi Arabia doesn't take it into account, but Surrey County Council lost the court case. But there you are. And this, of course, means that, in principle, this has set a precedent for other oil and gas licensing decisions as well, which raises the question of, if a company doesn't have plans for what to do about the emissions from the products it extracts, it won't be allowed to extract oil and gas in the UK. But the question I'm asking here, and I think this is, I'm not I want to be careful here, I'm not sort of scoring points here, but I think we do have to ask ourselves to what extent this is just a symbolic gesture. We recently had a visit from the president of a country which has recently discovered a very significant amount of oil and gas. He was visiting Oxford, and I got to meet him. They're not impressed, shall we say, by the United Kingdom, the world's oldest polluter, just as our oil and gas reserves were running out, saying, we're going to keep it in the ground. Now we think you should keep it in the ground too. And the main logic for this keep it in the ground decision is to set an example to the world. It's a point of principle. We should no longer profit from extraction of oil and gas. And I just really question whether that's a helpful example to set, because it's not an example the rest of the world can follow. And in fact, if anything, it's an example that oil and gas producers in the rest of the world find rather irritating, because we have benefited so mightily from production of fossil fuels in the UK in the past. So maybe we'll come back to that with questions, because I do think it's a challenging topic. I think Labour, by the way, are absolutely right, and I think to be confronting the producer conundrum, that it doesn't make sense to only think about the consumption of fossil fuels. We do have to address our responsibilities as producers. So in that respect, I think spot on to be talking about it. I'll be talking tomorrow night at Unheard. If any of you are members of Unheard, I think they still have some tickets available for members of Unheard. I'd be slightly surprised if there's any subscribers to Unheard in this room, but I will be talking to Claire Coutinho tomorrow evening at Unheard if you're interested in joining in. And I think you could probably join Unheard in the next 24 hours if you really felt strongly about it. And of course, they're very critical of this extraction ban, but I shall be making the point that, well, if you want to be critical of this extraction ban, fair enough. There's plenty to criticize. I'm critical of it too. But what's your policy? Just grumbling is not a policy. Maybe she'll just say, well, we're the opposition, so we just get to grumble. We don't have to say anything. But let's see. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. Because I think we need a policy for the producers. We don't have one at the moment. And I think it's high time governments and indeed everybody in the fossil fuel discussion, in the climate debate, including environmental NGOs, who are very much of the opinion they'd rather the fossil fuel industry just crawled away and died, but obviously shows no sign of doing so. We need to sort of step up to this challenge and think about what is going to happen. How is the industry going to respond as climate policy starts to bite? Because how is it responding at the moment? Can we get any hints from how the industry is reacting already to climate policy? I mean, there's some good news. In COP28 in Dubai, hosted by the United Arab Emirates, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter was launched, which was a commitment by producer countries and companies, so most of the big oil and gas companies signed up. Notable exception, actually I'm not quite sure whether Russia is involved, but anyway, they weren't until quite recently at least. And they said they were going to, they've taken on a commitment, well, an aspiration at least, to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions associated with the production of oil and gas. So quite a significant fraction of the emissions associated with our use of oil and gas are associated with their production. And as you can see from this graph behind me, the amount of CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by the production of oil and gas varies considerably depending where it comes from. You may not be able to read all the little country names, but the big bar down at the bottom is Venezuela. It takes a huge amount of energy and emissions to extract oil from Venezuela. It probably doesn't have to, but the Venezuelans are spectacularly inefficient in their oil and gas production. And then right at the top there, you've got Norway, which is remarkably clean relative to others. And of course, this is the Norwegians' arguments, and you probably see those big posters in Heathrow, if you've been through Heathrow recently, where Equinor is bragging about how much better its oil and gas are than everybody else's. And, there is a sense in which they have a point, so this is why the Norwegians certainly get grumpy when you talk about producer limits and so on and licensing restrictions, because they're saying, well, our oil and gas is relatively clean, so better that people use ours than other people's. But of course, all of that is in the context of the sort of slightly less good news. This is just now that's the same graph, but I've now added on what gets released when the oil and when a barrel of oil is refined and burned. Okay, so not all of that will be, the sum is released during the refining process, depending on what it's turned into. But basically, all of the carbon atoms in the barrel of oil that are sold, they're all going to end up as CO2 in the atmosphere, except for a tiny fraction that gets put into plastic. They love talking about what goes into plastic because it sort of slightly confuses people, but at the end of the day, it goes in the atmosphere. And so you can see, first of all, one striking thing about this is please don't buy Venezuelan oil. I mean, it's twice as emitting than, apologies to any Venezuelans in the room, but it really is dire. The rest of them, Well, there's pretty big variations, and you know, I think if I was Norway, I'd be really pointing at this, saying, "Look, come on, you know, at least you could shift to the cleaner sources if you're going to keep using it." And of course, this graph is worth remembering in the context of the other bit of news about the industry that people like to talk about a lot, particularly people who go to COPs and sort of financial types and so on, which is who's investing in oil and gas production. So one thing which, again, you'll read about plenty, certainly in the financial literature, is the fact that investment in fossil fuels, which are the pale blue lines behind me, peaked in 2015. And so since then, we've actually been investing in most years about the same, and since 2019 or so, much less in fossil fuel extraction than we have in renewable energy production or technologies associated with the transition. And by now, we're actually investing almost twice as much into non-carbon or zero-carbon alternatives than we are investing in new fossil fuel production. And many people on all sides of the argument might attribute some of that drop-off in fossil fuel investment to the Paris Agreement, which was agreed at the end of 2015. And many people would look at that graph and think, there we are, this is an industry now on the way out. They finally read the writing on the wall. They're investing. They're not investing in new exploration and new discovery because they're recognizing the inevitability of the fact that the world is going to transition away from fossil fuels. That's one way to read it, and I think there probably has been a factor in that. It's certainly been harder for fossil fuel companies and significantly harder for developing countries with new fossil fuel resources to raise money for fossil fuel development since 2015, and since the various agreements, including the agreement in Glasgow about the Net Zero Financial Alliance, Glasgow GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where basically the large financial institutions of the world agreed that they wouldn't lend money to any new fossil fuel extraction projects. So basically the only way you can finance them now is, unless your government is rich enough to help you out directly, or you get a loan from a country that doesn't care, is if you're a big enough operation that you just finance yourself. So obviously that's had a dampening effect on investment in the fossil fuels. But of course, there's a downside to this, because again, thinking back to that graph of dirtier fuels and cleaner fuels and so on, where this has left us is with a less and less, where if these trends continue, this will take us, is a world in which the big producers increasingly are the legacy producers that just have loads of it, don't need to do any exploration because they've got so much already. And that, of course, and people can argue about whether this was related or not, has left us to some extent vulnerable to people like Vladimir Putin, because, of course, he doesn't need to explore for fossil fuels because Russia's reserves are so huge. They don't really need to invest in further exploration. And indeed, this, of course, has been one of the mantras which Donald Trump has been repeating again and again in the course of his election campaign, that thanks to all these crazy green policies, we've been underinvesting in fossil fuel extraction, and that's left us vulnerable, and that's why your gas, as he would put it, is so expensive, because we haven't been investing enough in fossil fuels. And the difficulty we face is that the narrative that not investing in fossil fuels leaves us vulnerable to Vladimir Putin and not investing in fossil fuels makes your petrol more expensive has at least enough truth in it for it to be problematic politically. It certainly was problematic for the Harris campaign. And therefore, it's something we need to confront as to ask ourselves this question: who should invest in fossil fuels? And on what condition? This is a kind of demonstration on the lawn of my undergraduate college in Oxford. Several others, old friends from college, are here, including my dad, who was there as an undergraduate a little bit further ago. St. John's College was one of the last to divest from fossil fuels, and this was the Student Climate Justice Campaign. For some reason, with a model of the Sir David Attenborough research vessel. I'm not quite sure how that connected with the demo, but anyway, there they are on the Keep Off the Grass front lawn, making their point. And they certainly did, very successfully. And the college has divested. Although, I mean, I think there was an opportunity, it opened, for me, these student campaigns actually opened a really interesting conversation about the ethics of investment in the industry, because I was naturally drafted in by the students to talk to them, and I think they wanted me as an ally. We actually had a lot of very interesting conversations, because it's not clear to me that, in fact, what I put it to, that it's not clear, the answer is not that clear to me. In fact, I put it to them that perhaps the ideal owner of a fossil fuel asset is a university endowment with a very long time horizon. I mean, who else do you want to own the fossil fuel asset? They didn't agree with me, needless to say. But it was an interesting conversation, and great credit to the divestment campaign. They sort of, we had a conversation about it. We didn't, and actually coming out of that conversation, coming out of the conversations with the student divestment campaign, we came up with the Oxford Martin Principles for Climate Conscious Investment, which was back in 2018, before these things were sort of proliferating all over the world. There's now lots and lots of these sort of principles out there, and what we actually proposed in these principles, and this is not the same as everybody else's. In fact, we're going to come back to this in the next lecture, where we talk about standards for industries and standards for investment and so on. But in the Oxford Martin Principles, we said that investors should be asking whether companies have net zero plans, and obviously not investing in companies that don't have net zero plans, because if a company doesn't have a net zero plan, then it doesn't really have a plan if it's in the business of dealing with fossil fuels. But if a company did have a net zero plan, then there was no, we didn't, in the Oxford Martin Principles at least, we didn't say there was an obvious reason not to invest in it. In fact, you might argue that a fossil fuel company with a good net zero plan you should, as a point of principle, invest in it, because you need to support them. And as we'll see in a minute, it's challenging, because actually, by the way, at the time when we introduced this, one of the criteria was, does the company have a commitment to net zero at all? And that was actually quite a useful question in 2018, because none of them did. And then, of course, like in about 2 years later, they all did. And so that was, it suddenly became a bit like the sort of the leprechaun and the shamrocks. Suddenly it was sort of useless criterion. The big challenge in assessing any of these companies' plans is what they do with what they call Scope 3 emissions. In the greenhouse gas protocol, something that the industry actually made a lot of input to when it was designed back in the 2000s, they divide their scope, they divide the sort of emissions associated with their activities into three categories. Scope 1, which is the emissions from their refineries and from their extraction and so on, their sort of direct activities. Scope 2, emissions associated with the power they use, which is for these companies generally a pretty small contribution, because they generate their own power. And then Scope 3, which for an oil and gas company is the emissions associated with the stuff you sell. Here's Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, saying, well, that's our customers' CO2. I mean, ExxonMobil are very clear. I have no idea what he was actually saying at the time, but ExxonMobil are absolutely clear. In fact, they'll even take you to court for suggesting otherwise, that the carbon dioxide associated with the products they sell is not their carbon dioxide. Because after all, the products they sell are not causing global warming when they sell them. It's their customers that burn them. They're very clear about that. So that's, one line, and Darren Woods was back in Baku making a big point of the fact that, carbon accounting needs to be tightened up so that we don't have all this sort of attribution of Scope 3 emissions to oil and gas companies. So Exxon's line is, it's not a problem at all. It's not our problem at all. It's somebody else's problem. Some companies are starting to take that Scope 3 challenge seriously. BP has a stated aim to reduce the carbon intensity, so the emissions per unit of energy, of its sold energy products to net zero by 2050. So this is BP basically saying it's going to make sure that the full life cycle emissions of whatever it's selling in 2050 is net zero. They're not making great progress. They've managed to reduce it by 3% so far between 2019 and 23, and in their sort of scorecard thing, they're aiming to get to 15 to 20% by 2030 and then 100% by 2050. I think anybody in BP will acknowledge, and they're not going to be able to do that on their own. This is not something that the company can do, but they are very much hoping for a supportive policy environment that will allow them to do that. Other companies are perhaps talking about the Scope 3 challenge, but perhaps taking it less seriously. Shell, company of similar size to BP, their long-term plans, they're also committed to net zero by 2050. Exxon, by the way, says it's committed to net zero by 2050, but only of its own emissions, not including the emissions associated with the products it sells. Shell says it's got some kind of commitment to net zero by 2050, but it relies very heavily on carbon credits, on basically turning rocks, as I put it, turning rocks into trees. So buying large tracts of forest and then claiming the carbon that's being absorbed by the forests. And by the way, we had a paper just last week on that topic, where an awful lot of that carbon, which is being claimed, would have been taken up anyway, so it really oughtn't to be appearing on the ledgers at all. We're going to be talking about this at length in March, the next one lecture, about carbon offsetting. Does it really work? No prizes for a lot of it doesn't, but the question is whether we can actually come up with a carbon offsetting. So it's, just to encourage you to come anyway, so I haven't given away the punchline. We'll be asking ourselves whether there's a way of reconstructing a carbon offset market so that it would work, because we actually do need it to work. And of course, others are just not doing anything at all. In fact, Exxon has sued some activist investors. Tried to get a shareholder motion to Exxon demanding that it takes a target. I didn't even specify what the target was, but just takes a target, any target, for its Scope 3 emissions. It immediately sued the activists for, being annoying, and then continued to sue them even after they'd withdrawn the resolution, because, the punishment beatings continue. Eventually, the Exxon suit was thrown out by the judge, who just pointed out, this is ridiculous. These people have actually withdrawn their resolution and you're still suing them, so please go away. But it does go, that's the line they tend, as I say, that is the sort of hardball line they take. There was a lot of talk in Glasgow about how the world's financiers were going to embrace the need for net zero and channel trillions and trillions of global finance into the transition and support companies going through doing the right thing. And that, the world's financial markets were going to bring their enormous muscle. Rishi Sunak, of course, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, made a big deal out of this. That's where we're at. Yeah, BP, price-earnings ratio, in other words, the value of their shares compared to what they're paying out in dividends, 3.5. ExxonMobil and Shell, 11.5 and 12. So, really, when Rishi Sunak was talking about the world's financial markets financing our future, there's a lot of talk, but you don't see it in share prices. And you can see, here's BP, and you got a feel for them. This is what BP's share price has done since 1970. And, it dropped in, just noticed recently where the sort of climate policy really has sort of perhaps started to matter. We had the big drop during COVID, and then it recovered a bit, but it's sort of, wobbling along. Of course, there have been other events too. I mean, they lost their CEO under rather dubious circumstances and that sort of thing. So there may be other downward pressures on the share price than just the fact that they've got a climate policy, but it's, ExxonMobil's looks very different. People are pretty happy to own ExxonMobil stock. And, perhaps the market has a point. If we look at the cost of producing an extra barrel of crude oil, this is a fairly the paper from 2021 using data from a little while ago, because obviously the up-to-date data is quite difficult to get, as you might imagine. But you can see it varies very considerably around the world. But just look at the total numbers here. In a lot of places, all of the blues, the cost of producing one more barrel of oil is less than $6. And you're able to sell it for $70 today. So, of course you want to hold that stock. It's pretty expensive to produce in Colombia, by the way. That's the big red one at the end. But even there, it's profitable. And, that's the cost of producing an extra barrel of oil. It's even harder to find data on the total cost or the average cost of production because, of course, countries keep this sort of thing fairly close to their chests. There is a report from Wood Mackenzie, which actually was produced by 4 Bays, as it was back then, back in 2016. So this is sort of some, the most recent data I could find. They do produce an up-to-date one, but I would need to shell out $6,000 to see it, and Gresham didn't run to that. There you go. So I'm sorry I'm not showing you the latest numbers, but it gives you a sense of where the numbers are. This is where, back in 2016, Wood Mackenzie was predicting oil supply, oil costs would be. And, we're currently using about 100 million barrels a day. So that's the arrow there. That's sort of current consumption. And, that's roughly the current price in the sort of $60 to $80 a barrel range. So actually, Wood Mackenzie, that's what you'd expect. The price everybody's going to pay is the price of what it costs at the margin of the most expensive barrel to produce. So it's sort of plausible that that's still roughly the production costs. But notice there's some really cheap stuff in the Middle East costing, even total cost, never mind the incremental cost of producing one more barrel, the total cost of production is down below, well below $10 a barrel. And as you can see, as we move on to 2035, it doesn't change that much. There's still plenty of cheap stuff down there. Gas, European market, this was their predictions back then. Of course, here, prices are rather higher than they'd have predicted. But of course, what they didn't predict was what happened I'll just do that again, show off my PowerPoint. But the big beige bars are Russia, and we've obviously got rid of an awful lot of the Russian gas out of the European system. So actually, maybe Wood Mackenzie did pretty well, because you can see that they're actually still would predict roughly current European gas prices. What coal costs to supply is a mystery. It's very hard to get numbers, but basically there's places in Australia like this where you just scrape it off the ground. So not very much is the answer, and you can sell it for a lot. So, I mean, the cost of fossil fuels is so low that it's that's the real challenge we face in calls to phase them out. And what can we learn from other industries? I mean, here's another industry. The last time, actually, I thought in the world economy that we found apparently inexhaustible supply of high-density energy. So the whaling industry in the in the sort of 17th and 18th centuries. It's considerably more costly to extract than oil and gas. You can see, these people are acquiring that whale at considerable cost and risk to themselves. And this is a graph of how production, in the black dots, production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New Bedford, so the center of this, on the coast of Massachusetts, how production of sperm whale oil in New how that varied through the 19th century. And then the price, the selling price of whale oil, is the solid line at the top. And the sort of legend that's out there is that the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania sort of saved the whales. But actually, if you look at this graph, it doesn't really support that very well at all. Production peaked and then started to decline, and then the price went up. It was limited in how high it could go because of competition from mineral oil and the stuff that they'd found underground. But basically, they ran out of whales. I mean, that's what ended that industry. They didn't have the incentive to sort of really push the limits. But it didn't take long before technology evolved. People came up with ships that could go further and faster, and with steam-powered harpoons, with explosive tips and so on, which then resulted in, and also we also came up with all sorts of new uses of whale oil, like Chanel No. 5 perfume. Who knew that was made of whale oil? And so if we look here at the sperm whale catch, you'd have thought in 1900 that whaling was over. But no, people worked out different things to do with it, and by far the biggest catch was happening in the mid-20th century. And that's when the population the global population of sperm whales, which is shown on the top panel, really collapsed. So that's what happened with whaling. Compare that history to the history of the ozone problem, another big industrial problem in the past. As you can see here, the left panel here is the right panel here is production of CFCs, the chemicals that deplete the ozone layer. As you can see, we really brought that down very rapidly after the Montreal Protocol was signed, and the ozone hole, which developed, was getting very rapidly worse in the build-up to during the 1990s, is no longer getting worse. If I show you a graph of it, you can see that it's October to December ozone levels have bottomed out. It's not getting better yet, but it's certainly, we do seem to have arrested the really serious decline. It hasn't all been plain sailing. I mean, just a few years ago, there was a nice bit of sort of scientific detective work. Park et al. Discovered that there was a sort of mysterious source of CFC emissions from eastern China, and they had to work it out from offshore measurements because they weren't able to actually go into China to go and work out what was going on. And if we look in the 2012, that was emissions they inferred, and then that was what happened in 5 years later. They were really seeing a big increase in emissions in that region. And then that was the paper they published drawing attention to this, and you could sort of see that although CFC concentrations were meant to be coming down, they weren't coming down nearly as fast as they should, and that was followed up by a big environmental EIA investigation, and the government of China clearly cracked down on it, and this has been sorted out. So, but we need to keep on it. Governments need to keep on this case. It's a good story, this one, but it shows how hard it is to address. To deal with a very well-entrenched and incumbent industry. So these are the things I'd like to think about. And I will come back to this in the final lecture of this series about how we can craft climate policy to work with the fossil fuel industry rather than just hoping to get rid of it entirely. I mean, and I think but industries will fight for their survival. The fossil fuel industry is no exception. We saw that with the whaling industry. The whaling industry did not just quietly retire into the night. They actually found new uses for their product and went on catching more and more whales until they were finally banned. Ozone went a lot better than whaling. And I'm sort of throwing out hypotheses here, but I would say a big part of that was that no one's livelihood was directly threatened by the solution to the ozone problem. The companies that were producing ozone were also the companies producing the companies that were producing ozone-depleting chemicals were also the companies that were going to produce the ozone-depleting chemical substitutes. So, the substitutes are more expensive, which is why the original chemicals are still being used in China. But it was a financial decision to move on. So I think we do need to ask ourselves, can we find effective climate solutions that the fossil fuel industry will tolerate? I'm not asking them to like them, but I do think we need to come up with climate solutions that the industry can live with. And that's a big challenge, because it means talking to them, to finding out what they're doing. It means for the environmental movement, accepting this industry is going to be around for a long time, and we're going to have to work out what their limits are. And that doesn't mean climate policy, and I will come back to this in the final lecture, this doesn't mean climate policy has to be ineffective. In fact, I would argue that the most effective climate policy imaginable is one that actually works with the industry rather than against it. But hopefully that's given you some things to think about, and I imagine has sparked some questions. Thank you.